had a healthy debate in the House on that, and we tried to do 4 things. So we actually had filed a local aid resolution back in February, and we tried to bring it up on the floor, and we were turned back. And then some 3 weeks or 4 weeks later, the Speaker announced his local aid resolution that he wanted to do with the Senate President and the Ways and Means chairs, which was identical to the one we filed, absent we wanted to put in an additional $150 million, which we felt was sort of a reasonable amount of what we thought was overdue lottery money that was held back. Particularly realizing that every city and town in the Commonwealth this year is going to need to deal with the snow and ice deficit, and to try to avoid some of that impact, because we've had sort of a high impact winter this year. And usually when we meet, there's a weather event. Last time I was here was so, and we had, we tried in the House when we brought the resolution up a couple weeks ago, we offered 150, and that was rejected. We offered an amendment that said that by 2013 or 14, that we would get to a point where we dedicate 40% of our growth revenues or growth taxes, which is sales, income, and corporate taxes, would go, an amount equivalent to that would go to cities and towns. So basically, let's work towards getting towards that goal. That's sort of an MMA initiative. That was rejected. All because people felt like we were doing as much as we reasonably could this year, or the majority felt like we were doing as much as we reasonably could this year. So then we said, well, how about if we make this arrangement? How about if we say that if we take in more revenues than we're currently budgeting on taking in, that we agree that we'll share 50% of those with cities and towns, and we'll cap it at $200 million. So if we take in just $200 million more, we'll give cities and towns 100, and we'll keep 100 to do the things that we need to do, other things that we need to do. So if we take in 400, we'll give cities and towns 200, and we said we'll make it a very easy formula. We would do it per pupil. So, take total number of kids based on enrollment and simple division. I don't know if the Senate, I think you guys offered the same amendment in the Senate. And those are rejected. And we said, well, they were saying, well, we don't know what revenue's going to be. That's right. We don't know what revenue's going to be. And if they don't come in, then we don't have to enter into this. But let's agree up front that if all of us are here saying, look, we have a tremendous level of priorities, and I can honestly say that there's not one group that's come to my office this year that said, give me less money. Usually the ones that come in and say, just level fund me exactly to last year, are sort of gold stars this year. Most everything else is a little bit more. But a lot of those little bits add up to a lot of money. And to say, we're not going to share into that partnership, and that's very, very frustrating. And I will just touch on, Deanna touched on the municipal GIC. And I know North Reading maybe is having a discussion about going into that, and there's some discussion about whether the bar is set too high with 70%. But I would say that North Reading this year, from one of the things that sort of helped get further down the field in terms of where the town wants to be, is the fact that health insurance came in a lot lower. And I would argue that health insurance maybe came in lower because of municipal GIC and the fact that there was some competition out in the marketplace. And Blue Cross Blue Shield, which is a heavy municipal writer, has also come in with some more competitive or better rates. And it's frustrating to think that potentially over some number of years, that because there was, relatively speaking, a monopoly on municipal health insurance, that's money that's gone, that's not going to be regained, and that they can come in this year and say, 2% increase. I mean, if we had 2% increases going back some number of time, we wouldn't be having the frictions in town that we're having right now. So with that, I'll wait for the next.
Before we leave that subject,
yep.
Sometimes wish the camera wasn't on, but is there any?
So do we.
What do we do about that? That, in my opinion, is criminal. To think that with all the municipalities, children have all been impacted at such a huge degree. The reality is out there. I mean, is there a legislative process that begin, or a debate, or some kind of pressure that you can put on these companies? That's just not okay.
Well, it isn't okay, and it's frustrating to us, but if I put on my lawyer's hat for just a minute, it's very difficult for the legislature constitutionally to pass anything that interferes with a contract, and to go back and revisit contracts that were already in existence and for which you could argue we were overcharged is going to be difficult. There might be some legal recourse, just thinking out loud, that might be had, but that would have to be through the courts. It would be very difficult for us to revisit that, but as Brad said, what we're trying to do is put competitive pressure on them, and the Blues clearly felt that pressure, because they didn't want to lose a significant book of business for them. And so I think on a going forward basis, we've already started to achieve that. But it's very, very hard to go back and try to recapture that. We can look at that, but constitutionally, just at first blush, it would be difficult.
And the same is true for the benefits. I know that there's a similar thing going on where the benefits is also a big part of the increase in our staff in town. And I know that the state has offered for that to also be pulled into their benefit system. Has any of the towns gone into that system?
In terms of the retirement benefits,
Yeah.
there was a proposal, originally there was a proposal maybe to look at putting them all into the state system, then it was sort of underperforming. But we're already in, I think, the Middlesex County, we're already in there, so it really doesn't have a big impact. Reading has their own system, but like Reading's system has outperformed the state system. So Reading's like, leave us alone, we had a rate of return higher than the state and done very well. There are some, I think Essex County is one that's had some challenges. And some of the cities and towns that make up the Essex County system are looking, I think Ipswich was one, to looking to maybe get out, to try to go to the state system because the performance has been below. And that's a piece of the pension. There's also sort of a piece of the benefit side of it that we deal with in North Reading on some retirement costs and stuff that are entirely in the domain of the town and what the town negotiates.
I just want to also offer something very quickly. When Brad talked about the local aid resolution, you should know that he did yeoman's work and really started the fight in the House on that. We picked it up in the Senate, but he really pioneered that. One of the things that we've done together, we have something called the Republican Policy Conference, which I'm fortunate enough to chair on the Senate side. Brad appointed Representative Lascoco to chair on the House side. And as we began the legislative session, we brainstormed to think about things we could do on a number of fronts, and one of them was cities and towns. And one of the other things that we've proposed is that we set aside 10% of the state's stabilization fund for cities and towns. So that when times get tough, we know that we draw on our stabilization fund, we're going to draw on it in the coming year to balance the budget. What we're saying is out of that roughly $2.2 billion that we have in it right now, some of that should be set aside for cities and towns so that they have that cushion as well. And that way, if we ever get into a situation like we were in with withholding lottery payments, we have somewhere to turn to keep cities and towns whole. That bill's pending. I don't hold out a lot of optimism for it, but we continue to make those arguments. And that's one of the reasons why we really appreciate having the time to talk to you, because we can tell you about some of the things. And I'm glad to see Bob here. I didn't see you at the beginning, but I'm glad to see you here. We good to see you. And
Bob was here at 10.
Touche. But at any rate, it's sometimes we can have this conversation with you and get out some information that you might not otherwise get, and say, look, there are some tools that we think are important that maybe the leadership doesn't think is important, but that's how we build coalitions, by telling you about it, and you tell similarly affected communities, and hopefully we start to make some progress. And the one thing, the one thing that Stan has a reputation for, in my opinion and that of many others, is being realistic. And that's very important, is trying to target things that are within our reach. There may be other things we'd like to do, and we never need to lose sight of those, but we need to also think about what we can do. And building coalitions around things like the local aid resolution, including more money, and trying to set aside part of the stabilization fund, those are doable things. And we ought to be talking about how we can build stronger coalitions around them, and I think that's what we're doing.
One of the things, just to jump back to the local aid resolution, one of the frustrating things is getting it done in a more timely fashion. And I would say this year, we've been better than we have been in doing it. In some years, we've never done it. Last year, we did it in April. One of our amendments would say that we always would do it by March 15th at the latest, to kind of build a little bit of realism into our numbers and the governor's budget getting filed. And when you have a new governor, he gets an extra month to file, so that's usually in February, so we give a couple weeks. And that's been unsuccessful. It's just basically say, let's enter an agreement that says we'll let cities and towns know at a minimum what they're going to get. Now, one of the frustrating things is I know the proposal is basically for $100 million more Chapter 70. I know in a couple weeks we're probably going to we will take up a budget order in the House. I don't know if the Senate does the same. They usually maybe do an amendment filing timeline. Ours is an amendment filing timeline, it is also a content piece. So now that we've done a local aid resolution, the budget that comes out of Ways and Means is gonna reflect exactly what was in that resolution. To the extent you don't like anything, that I don't like what the other priorities that are within that budget, the order we adopt is gonna say that no amendment is in order to affect section 3, which is additional assistance, lottery distribution of chapter 70. And I find that very frustrating because you may look at the rest of the budget and say, I don't like the other priorities that we've chosen, I'd like to shift some of those around. If I offer an amendment, it's gonna be just automatically set aside. There'll be no opportunity to debate it, there'll be no opportunity to offer it, there'll be no opportunity to have discussion. That is a trend that is increased and has started several years ago in the House and has increased. It used to be, make sure all the amendments are filed by 5 o'clock on whatever day, and then these items can't be included, and more that's happening. And I think it is a fundamental flaw in the process. I realized we used to have budget debates that would go on for 6 weeks. We've gotten it down now to doing it in 2 or 3 or 4 days, much of it in a room down the hall. And I think that there's a process argument here that is really unfair to the members. And I would add, I think a piece of part of the problem with Chapter 70, this and that, is historically, the power in the legislature in terms of leadership has been urban versus suburban based. I would say the Senate, in electing Terry Murray, there's been a bit of a change there. The problem becomes, in changing any of these formulas, whenever you change a formula, if you don't do it with additional dollars going into it, you create a situation where people that maybe have been receiving money lose. And I think one of the inherent problems with the formula is that you use last year's enrollment. And when you're dealing with communities that are basically experiencing ever-increasing enrollment, you're always a year behind the 8 ball. To the extent the next year it drops down, maybe it evens out. But if you're always a year behind the 8 ball, it's sort of like a snowball going downhill. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think that's one of the reasons why a town like North Reading is facing some of the situation it's faced. So that you have a little bit of a problem, gets bigger and bigger, and it gets amplified. So.
Speaking to that, I think you just kind of hit the nail on the head with the formula and the aid that we get in North Reading, I'm sure other towns. It is a bit of a roller coaster, and there's no consistency to it, there's no reliable source there. I mean, it's there, but we have to wait till it's dated, and we have to wait till we get our share, and then it's based upon the formula, which is outdated and lags certain inflationary areas that are clearly salaries and enrollment issues. So I think, they said that's one of the key issues here, and one of the reasons where we'd like to get that resolved, or that priority to be out there, is that if we can fix that potentially, the formula, the way it's distributed, like you said, it may not actually increase from the state's budget what we have to actually fund, it may be a redistribution in the end. We read yesterday in the Globe where Medford, I believe it was Medford, had shifted $10 million from its reserve fund to fund education.
Boston.
So, that suggests to me that Boston has $10 million in a reserve fund and more, and so that says, and it did say that they didn't use it all. So there's more in the reserve fund, so where are they accumulating, how are they accumulating reserve? I'm not saying it's from the state's aid program, but potentially they are being overfunded and able to reserve.
A piece of it is that, communities, urban-based communities are able to qualify for federal